Thomas Willie and Alex Bolland. Two boys, both 14, spent months in a quiet corner of North Yorkshire, building something inside a backpack and writing down names. They were not playing a game, and they were not fantasizing. The judge, who would later read everything they had assembled, said plainly that this was a real plot, not wishful thinking. And the only reason it never reached the morning they had imagined came down to a single message sent over Snapchat, and one teenage girl who decided she could not keep it to herself. If you had asked anyone at their school near North Allerton about Thomas Willie and Alex Bolland, you would have heard about two unremarkable pupils. Willie was born in November of 2002, Bolland a month later in December. What the people around them could not see was that the two had grown fixated on the 1999 attack at Columbine High School in Colorado. They studied the two attackers closely and divided the roles between themselves, with Willie casting himself as the leader and Bolland stepping into the part of the follower. Their plan was modeled directly on that attack, a combination of firearms and homemade explosives aimed at named teachers and pupils they blamed for bullying them. Willie downloaded a notorious manual associated with improvised explosives and searched for ways to build them, gathering materials into a rucksack. Both boys hoped to get hold of shotguns that were lawfully owned by the father of Willie's girlfriend. Around the same stretch of time, Willie was separately responsible for an act of violence against that same girlfriend, an offense the courts would later treat with its own seriousness as unlawful wounding. To put it simply, this was not a vague threat scribbled in a notebook. It was a plan with chosen targets, gathered materials, and a route to weapons. And if no one had spoken up, this would be a very different story. What stopped it was Bolland himself. He told a friend over Snapchat what the two were planning. To her enormous credit, she did not laugh it off. She told her mother, and she told a teacher. On the 28th of September, both boys were pulled out of their lessons. Bolland gave what staff described as a calm, almost detached account to a vice principal, admitting the scheme in full. Willie took the opposite path, denying any involvement and, even as the school moved against him, continuing to plan. The case drew in multiple psychological experts, who assessed both boys at length before the matter reached trial. Both denied conspiracy, and both were convicted. On the 20th of July, 2018, at Leeds Crown Court, Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb delivered the sentences. She found Willie dangerous and handed him an extended sentence of 17 years, made up of 12 years in custody and a further 5 years on extended license, covering both the conspiracy and the wounding. Bolland, described as a fully engaged participant, but not the driving force behind it, received 10 years in detention. The judge was careful to underline the point that mattered most. This had not been daydreaming or teenage talk. It was a genuine plot, identified and dismantled before it could ever happen. What the court laid bare was how methodical the planning had become. The two had set their sights on a date the following year, treating the attack less as a flash of rage than as a project to be researched and supplied. Willie idolized the older of the two Columbine attackers and cast Bolland in the role of the second. And even after staff confronted him, he insisted nothing was wrong while quietly intending to carry on. The contrast between the two boys ran through the entire case. Bolland had folded almost at once, describing the plan flatly to a senior member of staff, while Willie held his line until the weight of the evidence made denial pointless. As of today, both remain in detention, and Willie's extended sentence means he will stay under supervision for years beyond any eventual release. No one was harmed in the way the two had imagined, and the case is now cited as an example of how a single decision to speak up can change the course of everything that follows. Willie and Bolland were stopped because a warning reached the right person in time. The next case is what that same kind of warning looks like when it is heard, written down, even passed around among classmates, and still somehow fails to prevent anything at all. Will Cornick. In a Spanish classroom in Leeds, a 15-year-old boy walked up behind a teacher who had stood in front of students at that same school for 40 years. What he did took only seconds. But what unsettled everyone afterward was not panic, and it was not remorse. He returned to his seat, told a friend it was a shame he had not finished what he set out to do, and had brought along something to mark the occasion. The teacher was Anne Maguire, 61 years old, a Spanish teacher at Corpus Christi Catholic College in the Halton Moor area of Leeds. She had taught there for 4 decades and was only months away from retirement. She and her husband Donald had 2 grown daughters. To her colleagues and the families who knew her, she was simply part of the school itself. The boy was Will Cornick, 15. His parents were separated but both described as supportive, and for much of his early life, there was little to suggest what was coming. That began to shift after he was diagnosed with diabetes, a diagnosis that ended his hope of joining the army and seemed to change him. Around Christmas of 2013, he began sending Facebook messages about wanting to harm Maguire. At one point, he even offered classmates £10 to do it for him. Those were warning signs in plain sight, and they went unanswered. On the 28th of April, 2014, midway through a Spanish lesson, Cornick approached Maguire from behind with a knife and inflicted fatal wounds. As the room scattered, the head of languages, Susan Francis, moved to shield her colleague and held a door shut against him. What followed told investigators almost everything they needed to know about his state of mind. Cornick made no attempt to flee. He admitted that he had planned what he did. A defense psychiatrist who assessed him, Dr. Kent, told Leeds Crown Court that the boy showed a striking absence of empathy for his victim, a level of callousness rarely encountered in clinical practice, and that he presented a real risk of serious harm to the public. That last point would shape everything about how the court handled him. Cornick pleaded guilty to taking Anne Maguire's life. On the 3rd of November, 2014, Mr. Justice Coulson sentenced him to a life term with a minimum of 20 years before he could even be considered for release. In an unusual step, the judge lifted the reporting restrictions that would normally have kept a defendant of that age anonymous, explaining that naming him carried a clear deterrent value for others. Cornick challenged his sentence and lost that appeal in January of 2015. In 2017, an inquest examined the circumstances of Maguire's death and the school's response. The 2017 inquest went beyond the act itself and examined whether anyone could have intervened. Classmates had seen the messages in which Cornick spoke about wanting to harm his teacher, and some had treated them as dark talk rather than real intent. The detail that stayed with people was the bottle he had carried into school that day, brought as a private celebration, because it spoke to how completely he had settled on what he meant to do long before he did it. For Maguire's husband and their 2 daughters, the proceedings offered facts without ever offering an explanation that made sense. As of now, Cornick is still serving his life sentence and will not be eligible to even apply for parole until around 2034. In the aftermath, tributes came from figures as prominent as Pope Francis and the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron. An educational trust was established in Anne Maguire's name, offering bursaries in the arts to young people, so that the 4 decades she gave to teaching would keep reaching students long after she was gone. Cornick set his sights on someone he knew, someone he saw every day. The next case moves a few counties south, where a teenager went looking for people he had never met. chosen for no reason at all beyond being in the wrong place. James Fairweather. For roughly 3 months in 2014, the town of Colchester could not even agree on what it was hunting. 2 people, with nothing connecting them, were attacked at random in public spaces. Some believed there had to be 2 separate attackers. The person actually responsible turned out to be a teenager who kept a photograph of a notorious killer and had studied the most infamous ones the way other students study for an exam. James Fairweather was 15 at the time of the attacks and 17 by the time he was convicted. He was a pupil at Colchester Academy who had been bullied over his prominent ears and who was struggling with dyslexia that had not yet been diagnosed. Away from school, his interests had curdled into an obsession with serial killers. He kept a photograph of Peter Sutcliffe, and he spoke of Ted Bundy as a kind of favorite. He also already carried a conviction from earlier that year for a robbery committed at knife point. The first life he took was that of James Atfield, 33, a father who had suffered serious brain damage in a car crash in 2010. Atfield was attacked in Castle Park on the 29th of March, 2014. Months later, on the 17th of June, Nahid Al-Manea, a 31-year-old Saudi postgraduate student at the University of Essex, was attacked on the Salary Brook Trail. Both were chosen at random, both with a bladed weapon, and neither knew the person who came for them. The investigation became one of the largest Essex police had ever run, with more than 900 witnesses interviewed. Because the victims had nothing in common, detectives initially had to weigh whether they were looking for 2 killers rather than 1. A mistaken theory that one attack might have been a hate crime even drew threats of reprisal from outside the country. The break came on the 27th of May, 2015, when a dog walker reported a young man loitering in a way that felt wrong. Officers found Fairweather wearing gloves and carrying a lock knife. At trial in Guildford Crown Court, his defense argued that he should be found guilty only of manslaughter by diminished responsibility, claiming that voices had told him to make a sacrifice. The prosecution's psychiatrist, Dr. Philip Joseph, was unconvinced. He described the hallucinations Fairweather reported as cliched and unpersuasive, the kind of account that did not hold up under scrutiny. The jury agreed. Fairweather was convicted of taking both lives on the 22nd of April, 2016, and sentenced a week later, on the 29th of April, to a life term with a minimum of 27 years. He later tried to argue that his age should reduce the sentence. That argument was rejected. For the people of Colchester, the months between the 2 attacks were defined by a low, constant unease, with parks emptying out and daily routines quietly rearranged across a town that did not know who it was avoiding. The legal fight that followed turned almost entirely on Fairweather's mind. His lawyers leaned on the idea that he had acted under the command of voices, while the prosecution argued the account had been assembled after the fact, borrowed from the killers he so admired. When the jury sided with the prosecution, it closed the door on the one argument that might have changed how the law saw him. As of today, Fairweather remains in custody and cannot be considered for parole any earlier than around 2042. In Nahid Al-Manea's memory, the University of Essex created the Al-Manea Scholarship, turning a stranger's loss into something that would help students she would never meet. Fairweather was a teenager who studied killers from a distance and then went looking for victims among strangers. The next case crosses the Atlantic to a boy who did not have to go looking at all, because everyone he intended to harm was already sitting in the same room as him. Barry Lukaitis. On a winter morning in 1996, a 14-year-old boy walked into his middle school math class in Moses Lake, Washington, wearing a long coat in the dead of winter. Underneath it, he was carrying a hunting rifle and 2 handguns. By the time a teacher had wrestled him to the floor, 3 people in that room would never leave it alive. Barry Lukaitis was 14 years old, and by most accounts, a deeply troubled one. He suffered from depression and had been bullied, reportedly including by one of the students who later became a victim. Investigators and commentators afterward pointed to a steady diet of violent media he had absorbed, a music video, a film, and a Stephen King novel among them. Though influences like those explain almost nothing about why so few boys in the same circumstances ever do anything like this. On the 2nd of February, 1996, at Frontier Middle School, Lukaitis opened fire in his math class and then briefly held the surviving students hostage. A teacher named John Lane managed to get close enough to disarm him and pin him down until police arrived, an act that almost certainly prevented further harm. The lives taken that day were those of the class teacher, Leona Carries, and 2 of the students. Another student was wounded and survived. Lukaitis was tried as an adult in Seattle. His attorneys pursued an insanity defense, and it was rejected. He was convicted in 1997 and handed 2 life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 205 years, a sentence designed to ensure he would never walk free. That might have been the end of it, except that the law itself shifted underneath the case. In 2012, the United States Supreme Court ruled that automatic life sentences without parole could not be imposed on juveniles. That decision reopened sentencings across the country, and Lukaitis was among those affected. On the 19th of April, 2017, he was resentenced to 189 years before Grant County Superior Court Judge Michael Cooper, who came out of retirement specifically to handle the case. Lukaitis waived any future appeals and this time spoke. He apologized for what he had done, describing it as weak, evil, and senseless. The influences investigators cataloged read like a list of the era's anxieties: a music video about a troubled student, a film built around a killing spree, and a Stephen King novel centered on a school attack that the author later pulled from print himself. None of it amounted to a cause. What stood out instead was the courage inside that classroom, where the teacher who tackled Lukaitis closed the distance knowing he was armed, and almost certainly kept a terrible morning from becoming far worse. Years later, at the resentencing, that contrast hung over the room as Lukaitis finally chose to speak. As of now, he remains incarcerated, and the length of that term means he will, in practical terms, die in prison. In the years since, he has earned both a high school diploma and college degrees behind bars, and has worked as a teacher's aide inside the facility, a quiet detail that sits uneasily against the mourning that put him there. Lukaitis was 14, and the system spent decades wrestling with how to punish someone that young. The next case pushes that question even further, to a defendant so young that his sentencing forced an entire state to rewrite how it treats children who commit the most serious crimes. Colt Lundy and Paul Gingerich. When an Indiana court finally sentenced one of the 2 boys responsible for what happened inside a Cromwell home in 2010, he was 12 years old. Many believe he was the youngest person in the state's history ever sentenced as an adult. The act had been planned. The goal was to run away, and the obstacle, as the boys saw it, was a single grown man standing between them and the life they imagined. The 2 were Colt Lundy, 15, and Paul Gingerich, 12, with a third 12-year-old keeping watch. The man whose life would be taken was Philip Danner, 49, Lundy's stepfather. The plan the boys had built between themselves was simple and almost childish in its logic. They wanted to leave home and head for Arizona or California, and they had decided Danner was the thing stopping them. On the 20th of April, 2010, inside the family's Cromwell home, that plan was carried out. A detective named Jonathan Tyler later testified that Lundy had retrieved Danner's own revolver along with a handgun, and that the pair waited before Danner's life was taken, each of them firing twice. In court, the most serious charges were ultimately set aside in favor of guilty pleas to conspiracy to take a life. Lundy received 30 years with 5 suspended, leaving 25 years to serve. Gingerick, at 12, was likewise sentenced as an adult to 25 years, and it was that fact, a child of his age being routed into the adult system, that drew national attention and unease. The discomfort eventually reshaped the law. Indiana passed what became known as Paul's Law, creating a path for blended juvenile and adult sentencing that gave courts more flexibility with very young offenders. Gingerick was resentenced under the new framework and released in March of 2017, after nearly 7 years in custody. His release came with conditions, electronic monitoring, court supervision running to 2020, and roughly 10 years of probation. The case became a turning point in how Indiana thought about its youngest defendants. The image of a child of 12 being processed through the adult system unsettled lawmakers enough to build a new framework, one that let a court start a young offender in the juvenile system while holding an adult sentence in reserve. That was the door Gingerick eventually walked through, though it never opened for Lundy, whose original sentence kept him on a separate track entirely. Through all of it, Danner's daughter returned again and again to insist that her father not be lost inside a conversation that had become mostly about the ages of the boys who took him. Since then, Gingerick has kept a deliberately low profile. He took a manufacturing job, lived with his mother in the Fort Wayne area, and declined interviews, choosing quiet over attention. Lundy's path was different, because he did not qualify under Paul's Law. Following a ruling in October of 2018 by Kosciuszko County Superior Court Judge David Cates, Lundy left the Department of Correction around the 15th of March, 2019, to serve the remainder of his time through County Community Corrections, beginning a 5-year probation term on the 1st of December, 2019. Like several others in these cases, he used his years inside to earn a high school equivalency and an associate degree. Danner's daughter, Natasha Hoffman, opposed his release, a reminder that for the family at the center of it, no resentencing ever closes the wound. These 5 planned in backpacks and basements and bedrooms against teachers, strangers, classmates, and a stepfather. The cases that follow move closer still, into the lives of people who trusted these boys most. The teachers who graded their work and the families who raised them, where the calm, deliberate planning is exactly what the courts would find hardest to forgive. If you like this video and haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale. Every weekday, a 66-year-old Spanish teacher in Fairfield, Iowa, took the same walk through the same park. Before she ever stepped into a classroom, she had worked as a flight attendant and trained as a licensed commercial pilot. On the 2nd of November, 2021, 2 of her own students were waiting for her along that familiar route. The reason they later gave for what they did was almost impossibly small. Nohema Graber had built a life that had very little to do with how it would end. By the time she was teaching at Fairfield High School, the daily loop through Chautauqua Park was simply part of her routine, something the people who knew her could set a clock by. What she did not know was that 2 of the teenagers she taught, Willard Chayton Miller and Jeremy Goodale, both 16, had been watching that routine and planning around it. On that November afternoon, the two ambushed Grauber during her walk and fatally harmed her with a baseball bat, then concealed her where they hoped she would not be found, beneath a tarp, a wheelbarrow, and railroad ties. The motive, as it emerged, came down to a single grade. Miller was angry about a mark he believed was dragging down the grade point average he needed, and which he feared would cost him a chance to study abroad. A life was taken over a number in a grade book. What undid them was how much they had said to each other. Witnesses had seen two young men driving Graber's van, and when investigators looked closer, they found a trail of social media messages between the two that laid out the motive, the planning, and the concealment in their own words. Then came the detail that hardened the case. Goodale agreed to cooperate, turning state's evidence and being listed as a witness against Miller. Both pleaded guilty to first-degree homicide in April of 2023. Because of their age, neither faced a mandatory life sentence without parole. On the 6th of July, 2023, District Judge Sean Showers sentenced Miller to life, with the possibility of parole after 35 years. That November, Goodale, viewed as more remorseful and more cooperative, received life with parole eligibility after 25 years. Miller challenged his sentence, and on the 11th of October, 2024, the Iowa Supreme Court unanimously upheld it, ruling that the state's constitution does not categorically forbid setting minimum prison terms for juvenile offenders. At sentencing, the loss was measured in more than a single life. Members of Graber's family spoke of a woman whose second career had been a calling rather than a job, and the hearings drew a long line of impact statements. The appeal that followed carried weight well beyond this one case, because the Iowa Supreme Court's decision set a marker for how the state could sentence juveniles going forward, confirming that long minimum terms remained available even for offenders this young. For Fairfield, a small town unused to this kind of attention, the annual walk became a way to hold onto the teacher rather than the crime. As of today, both remain incarcerated. The grief did not stop at the park. Grauber's husband, Paul, died of cancer after her death, and the family has said that his depression in the aftermath hastened his decline. Each year, the community gathers for a memorial walk in her name, retracing a route she once walked alone. Graber's students turned on her over a grade. The next case moves more than 500 miles south to Memphis, where another educator was targeted by a student who felt he had been wronged. Except this time, the planning had been underway for months. Eduardo Marmolejo. On the third day of a new school year in Memphis, Tennessee, a 16-year-old walked into a classroom carrying a knife he had sharpened the night before. He had not decided to do it that morning. He had been planning it since the spring, had studied close combat techniques, and had worked out exactly when his principal would be alone. The school was Memphis Junior Academy, a small Seventh-day Adventist school, and the principal was Suzette York, 49. The student was Eduardo Marmolejo, 16 at the time of the crime. On the 10th of August, 2011, only the third day of classes, he fatally attacked York with that knife inside a classroom. When police questioned him, Marmolejo did not minimize what he had done. He told them he had been planning it since May, that he was angry over privileges that had been taken away from him, that he had researched how to fight at close range, and that he had chosen his moment because he knew York would be by herself. The evidence left investigators with little to untangle. There was a confession, and there was forensic evidence to match it. The prosecutor, Reggie Henderson, summed it up plainly, describing it as an overwhelming case built on a confession and physical proof. there was a psychological thread running underneath it as well. A psychologist who evaluated him in juvenile court noted that he sometimes slipped into a fantasy in which he believed he was a soldier. Later, evaluations in adult court, however, found him competent to stand trial. A juvenile judge moved the case into the adult system, and he was indicted in February of 2012. The resolution came not from a jury, but from a decision Marmolejo made himself. On the 3rd of September, 2013, by then 18 years old, he told criminal court judge Mark Ward that he wished to plead guilty to second-degree homicide and accept a sentence of 35 years without the possibility of parole. It was a striking choice, because that term was longer than the 15 to 25 years he might have received had he gone to trial and lost. He accepted it in part because York's husband wanted to avoid a trial, and in court, Marmolejo apologized, saying he was no longer the person he had been, that he had become a better man. The choice to plead also reflected the wishes of York's husband, who did not want to relive the loss across weeks of testimony. And Marmolejo's acceptance of a longer term spared the family that ordeal. The soldier fantasy that had surfaced in the earlier evaluation never amounted to a legal defense, because by the time the case reached adult court, he was found fully competent to answer for it. What remained on the record was a portrait of cold preparation, a young man who had treated the planning almost as a discipline, studying and readying himself for something he then carried out on an ordinary school morning. As of now, he is still serving that 35-year sentence in Tennessee, with no parole to look forward to at its end. It remains one of the rare cases where a young defendant asked for more time rather than less, accepting the longest term on the table so that a grieving family would not have to sit through a trial. Marmolejo planned for months and then confessed to everything. The next case unfolded around the same period, far to the northeast, where another teacher known for going out of her way to help her students would be betrayed by one of them, and where the evidence would be caught, frame by frame, on camera. Philip Chisholm. Colleen Ritzer was 24 years old and only in her second year of teaching, already known around her school for staying after class to help any student who asked. On the 22nd of October, 2013, one of those students lingered behind too. By the end of that night, Ritzer was gone, and the boy was walking along a highway several towns away, carrying things that did not belong to him. How does a 14-year-old who had only just arrived in a new state end up at the center of something like this? Philip Chisholm had moved to Danvers, Massachusetts, from Tennessee, where he was born in January of 1999. He was a talented junior varsity soccer player who had grown quiet and withdrawn in the weeks before that day. His parents' marriage was falling apart, and court records would later allege that he had endured harm within his own home. Ritzer, by contrast, was exactly who she appeared to be. An Assumption College graduate who had finished near the top of her class and who poured herself into her students. After class that day, Chisholm followed Ritzer carrying a box cutter and gloves, took her life, and moved her from the school. Then he left. The pieces came together quickly. Surveillance cameras had captured him following her and moving a recycling barrel through the building. Officers found him walking along a highway in Topsfield, in possession of Ritzer's credit cards and other belongings, with blood on his clothing. He admitted what he had done and led police to where she had been left. At trial, his defense argued that he had been psychotic and hearing voices. The jury did not accept it. On the 15th of December, 2015, Chisholm was convicted of first-degree homicide, along with additional grave felony charges arising from the same attack and armed robbery. In February of 2016, Judge David Lowy sentenced him to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years for the homicide. and added a concurrent term of 40 years and a day for the remaining charges, meaning he would not be eligible for parole until he was roughly 54. He later pleaded guilty to a separate 2014 attack on a clinician at a detention center, drawing a concurrent term of 17 to 20 years. His efforts to undo the verdict ran out in early 2025. On the 25th of February that year, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court unanimously denied his bid for a new trial or a reduced sentence, holding that a 40-year prison term did not shock the conscience. The case did not end with the verdict on the original charges. While awaiting trial, Chisholm attacked a clinician at the facility holding him, drawing a separate guilty plea and additional time, and reinforcing for the court the assessment that he remained dangerous. When the state's highest court finally closed off his appeals in 2025, it ended years of uncertainty for Ritzer's family, who had sat through every stage of every proceeding. The scholarship they built in her name carries forward the part of her that her students remembered most. A teacher who treated staying late to help as simply part of the job. As of today, Chisholm remains incarcerated and is now in his mid-20s. The Ritzer family, who have spoken of him in the harshest terms imaginable, established a scholarship in Colleen's name, ensuring that the things she cared about most, helping students move forward, would keep happening without her. Everything Chisholm did was caught on camera within hours. The next case is almost the opposite. A teenager who planned so carefully and covered his tracks so completely that the only thing that ever connected him to the crime was his own need to talk about it. Daniel Marsh. In the early hours of an April morning in 2013, a 15-year-old moved through a quiet neighborhood in Davis, California, trying door after door and window after window, looking for one that had been left open. He had taped over the soles of his shoes so he would leave no prints behind. And he had been imagining a night like this one for years. Daniel William Marsh had a long and documented history of violent thoughts well before that night. By his own later account, the fantasies had been building for a long time, and on this night, he set out to act on them. He dressed in black, pulled on gloves, armed himself with a knife, and worked his way through the neighborhood, checking somewhere between 40 and 50 homes for a way in. He found one through a cut window screen, 2 doors down from where his father lived. Inside were Oliver Northup, 87, an attorney and bluegrass musician, and his wife Claudia Mulpen, 76, who served as a pastoral associate at the Davis Unitarian Church. Both were asleep. Both had their lives taken that night by a stranger who had chosen their house essentially at random. The planning had been so meticulous that it left investigators with almost nothing. There was no useful physical evidence, no obvious motive connecting a 15-year-old to an elderly couple he had never met. What finally exposed him was Marsh himself. He could not keep it to himself, and he began bragging to friends about what he had done. When police closed in, he confessed, and disturbingly, he described the experience in terms of happiness. The psychological portrait that emerged at his hearings was as alarming as the crime. At a 2018 hearing in Yolo's Superior Court, forensic psychologist Dr. Matthew Logan testified that Marsh's result on a standard psychopathy assessment was among the highest he had ever recorded. Another expert offered an equally grim characterization, while a defense neurologist diagnosed dissociative and mood disorders. Tried as an adult, Marsh mounted an insanity defense that failed. He was found legally sane. He was convicted in September of 2014, and that December, Judge David Reed sentenced him to 52 years to life. In the years that followed, California voters and lawmakers reshaped how juvenile cases are handled through Proposition 57 and related legislation. which triggered repeated hearings over whether Marsh's case truly belonged in adult court. In 2018, the Yolo Superior Court hearing upheld both the adult conviction and the sentence. The legal aftermath stretched on far longer than the trial itself. As California rethought how it handled juveniles, Marsh's case moved between courtrooms over the question of whether a 15-year-old should ever have been tried as an adult, and each ruling reopened the wound for the families. The hearings produced some of the most chilling testimony of any case here. Expert after expert describing a young man whose capacity for empathy appeared to be absent rather than merely damaged. The families of the couple have come to treat every parole-related date as a fixture on their calendar, determined to be in the room each time it comes around. As of now, Marsh is incarcerated at a state correctional facility in San Diego, serving 52 years to life. According to corrections records, he becomes eligible for a parole hearing in December of 2036. The families of Oliver Northup and Claudia Maupin have appeared repeatedly to oppose any move toward early release, returning each time to speak for the couple who can no longer speak for themselves. Marsh planned in total silence and was undone only by his own bragging. The final case is what happens when the planning is not silent at all. When a teenager lays out his intentions in front of an online audience and then carries them to the doors of a school full of children. Jesse Osborne, a 14-year-old in a small South Carolina town, spent months talking with others online about carrying out an attack, comparing ambitions the way some people compare scores in a game. Then, on an afternoon in late September of 2016, he tried to turn those conversations into something real at the elementary school he had once attended. He came far closer to catastrophe than the final toll suggests. Jesse Osborne had already been removed from a previous school after bringing weapons there. He was bullied, and he later described an abusive home life. In the lead-up, he immersed himself in the histories of past mass shootings, studying attacks at Columbine, Sandy Hook, and Virginia Tech, and he took part in an online group that prosecutors would later describe as a sleeper cell of would-be school attackers. In his own writing, he spoke of wanting to surpass the people who had come before him. On the 28th of September 2016, Osborne took his father's life at home. Jeffrey Osborne was 47. He then took his father's truck and drove to Townville Elementary, a school he had attended as a younger student, crashed through a fence, and opened fire with a handgun toward children on the playground. The weapon jammed, and a volunteer firefighter named Jamie Brock tackled him and held him down. A young student who was wounded that day later died from blood loss. 2 other students and a teacher were injured and survived. The evidence against him was vast and largely created by his own hand. Investigators recovered a 46-page confession, his internet search history, and the messages from his group chat. He had, in fact, been on a live video call during the attack itself. At his hearings, experts testified to conduct disorder and an emerging personality disorder, and to a striking lack of empathy. Tried as an adult, Osborne pleaded guilty to 2 counts of taking a life and 3 counts of attempted. In November of 2019, the judge imposed life for the 2 deaths, plus 30 years for the attempted counts. The matter was not entirely settled, though. In May of 2023, Osborne apologized for the first time and asked to be resentenced. On the 22nd of September, 2023, Circuit Judge Lawton McIntosh converted the 2 life terms into 2 terms of 75 years, to be served day for day. The order described the result as effectively a life sentence, but the specific number allowed him to take part in Department of Corrections programs. As of today, Osborne remains incarcerated. In one of the most striking responses to come out of any of these cases, the mother of the young student who died publicly forgave him, even as she supported the life sentence. The child's funeral drew national attention and became, for many, the lasting image of what was lost that day. The response from the community became, in its own way, as memorable as the crime. The mother of the child who died chose forgiveness publicly while still asking the court for the harshest sentence available, a position that drew national attention for its mix of grace and resolve. The resentencing years later was less an act of mercy than a technical adjustment. Because a fixed term, even one as long as 75 years served day for day, opened doors to prison programming that 2 life sentences had kept shut. In practical terms, Osborne is expected to remain behind bars for the rest of his life. All 10 of these defendants are still in custody or under court supervision today. Some will face parole boards in the decades ahead. Others will not live to see release. What every one of these cases forced the courts to weigh was the same impossible question: how much youth should matter when the harm is this permanent? Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.